Hi everyone, I'm Gina, the creator and hands of Fibers and Design. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to weave with roving. Let's get started. Before we get started, did you know that it takes practice to develop your weaving skills? Like any muscle, our creativity and weaving skills need time to practice to improve. As a beginner weaver, it may be a bit challenging to know exactly where to start. Well, my weaving ebook, Side-by-Side Weaving, Lines and Density, walks you step by step from creating and planning a design to weaving and displaying it. You can find the ebook on the Fibers and Design website. The link is in the bio. Now, let's continue with the tutorial. First, let's talk about roving. What is it? Roving is unspun yarn, so it's not as strong as spun yarn, such as the yarn you use for warp or other weft yarns. The roving comes in a tube-like form. Although the fibers aren't spun together, their structure allows them to stay together when a large section is pulled. So, when you want to remove a part, slightly pull a section of the roving off. Now that we have some information about roving, let's take a look at a few design ideas for weaving with it. I've prepared the loom to have low warp spacing. The roving is thick, so it doesn't need very high density to keep them in place as you're weaving. Throughout this tutorial, I will use this chunky wool yarn in between the rows of roving. I'll start here by weaving 2 rows of twining and a few rows of plain weave. This will give the design a secure base and begin the design. If you're unfamiliar with the twining pattern or the plain weave pattern, then I will leave a link down in the description box to the tutorials on how to do them. Once I've finished creating the base, I tuck in the weft end to the back of the weaving. Gently break apart a section of the roving. Only a few small sections are needed. Then weave the roving through the warp. The roving will lay flat over the weft. Now it's up to you how much roving to include in each row. Here I'm just experimenting and adding a few sections of the roving within the line, but if you want to add 3 little sections or more or use different colors, you can do that too. To secure the roving, I'm going to weave another row of plain weave on top. Here you can see the roving is used as color accents. However, it does create an uneven plain weave pattern, so I've added more roving to even out the design. Here there's already enough end of this roving tail, so I'm going to just use this. I'm using my tapestry needle to just help push and pull it through between the warp. But as you can see here, I'm just trying to even out the design with the plain weave. Now, if you're working on something with more texture, then maybe it doesn't matter if the pattern is even or not. But here, just for this example, I'm showing you how you can easily just fix the accenting of the colors. The small sections of roving need more structure, so weave a few rows of plain weave over them. You can use the tip of the tapestry needle to pull some of the roving out to make it appear fluffier, but be sure to give the back some support so that the ends do not become too loose. Next, pull off a thicker strip of roving and weave it through the warp. The tricky thing about weaving roving or a larger piece of roving is that it can become twisted while you're weaving it, or the fibers might come apart. You may find it easier to weave the roving by adding a shed stick. You can simply use a strip of cardboard to hold open the shed while you add in the roving. For a short tutorial on how to use or create a shed stick, I will leave a link down below in the description box. Sometimes you might find some things in your roving. Remember, it does come from a natural source, so. You can use the tip of the tapestry needle to pull some of the roving out to make it appear fluffier. Be sure to give the back some support so that the ends do not become too loose. The section of roving here is a bit more thicker than the one that we used before. And so here you can really start exaggerating the shape and the texture of the roving simply by using your tapestry needle. And your fingers. Use your fingers to help hold the previous sections in place, and you can really start creating this bubbled effect. Also tuck in the roving ends so they do not come loose. Now that the roving is in place, it's created a very nice bubbly texture. So we're going to go on to the next section where we're going to add some color. To divide the sections, I'm going to weave just a few rows of plain weave. There are so many ways to add and mix colors. Here are just a few ideas. In the first example, I am layering the colors together. So first I'm taking the lighter color and weaving it through, then the darker color, in this case the orange, and then finally I sandwich this darker color with the same lighter color from the bottom, and I'm putting it on top. Once they have been added to the same row, beat the roving down with a fork or a weaving comb. As you weave each row, you can move the roving around to show one color more than the other or blend them better together. Before I start the next section, I'm going to quickly just weave a row of plain weave and start the next side. In the next section, I'm only using 2 strips. First the darker color and then the lighter one. Here you can see the color poking out more and adding some pop to the design. To reduce the brightness of the color pop effect, you can add a few extra strands of the lighter color or your secondary color. It can be tough to keep roving in one piece as you weave it between the warp, so weaving small strips or sections can help you manage each row. In this section, I'm only using one color, and I'm spacing out the roving to create a wider design and texture. Here I'm just lightly weaving a few rows. The wider warp spacing works so well with this thicker strip of roving. The weft rows stack really well, one on top of the other. These designs are only using the plain weave pattern, with just some simple variations. So plain weave is plain, but you can also make it interesting and exciting when you're using different textures or combining colors. In this next section, I'm going to create an ombre effect with the roving. For this, you need at least 2 colors of roving. Here I'm using the same 2 colors from before, this bright orange and cream color. To create the gradient or ombre effect, we first have to create some transition colors. We can do this by taking apart the roving and combining the 2 colors together gradually. First, I create a base with 1 color, then break apart a few sections of the second color. You don't want to add too much, just lightly cover the first color with the second color. Here the cream roving is still very visible and slightly covered by the orange roving. Next, I take 2 small sections of the orange roving and open them up. They are thin, but not as thin as the previous section. Having the previous section nearby is a helpful tool to compare the color transition levels. Then I take 1 small section of cream roving and open it up. Once that's finished, it will be layered on top of the 2 orange layers. Now the cream roving isn't so visible, but the orange is not too bright either. Now that the 2 transition sections are created, we will add a section of cream and an orange section. You want to open up the roving sections if they're really folded together. The roving that I'm using is in smaller sections, so it's taking me a bit longer to piece the sections together, but once they're pushed together, they should stay together all right. Ideally, they'll be in larger sections, but you have to work with what you have. Now we have 4 sections that gradually transition from one color to the other. Using the soumak weave pattern, I'm slowly adding the first section of roving to the warp. Ideally, all of the roving is in one piece, but sometimes it can be a bit challenging to wrap the roving around the warp. So you can wrap the roving around 4 warp strings or more so that there's more space. I'm really taking the time to define these loops of the roving. I'm using my fingers and a tapestry needle to create and exaggerate this fluffy texture. The roving really needs you to help guide it, especially if you have a lot of warp strings. Next, add the second section. The pattern is moving in another direction, so it creates this braid design. As I'm building the design, I'm also twisting some of the roving and the fibers in it because I wanted to show more of some colors than the others. So in some parts, if I feel that the orange isn't showing enough, then, I'm just tweaking it a little bit so that you can see it more in each row. As the third section is added, the ombre design starts to really become apparent and it looks so lovely and the colors are really starting to pop. If you notice that the fibers are kind of coming apart, really just take the time to add them in slowly and just make sure that everything is staying secure. If there are any sections that come loose, I like to just tuck them in before you start the next loop, and that way it stays secure behind one of the warp strings. Finally, add the last section of the orange roving. Here again, take the time to build and define the texture and the color, and really if you need to move any of the yarns around, make sure that you do that so that the full design comes together and to really create that nice color pop. And there it is. Ah, such great texture and color. I really love this technique and it just adds a whole nother dimension to your design. In this section, I want to talk more about movement and shape. So here are a few tips that I have when developing shapes or forms when using roving. The first is to play around with a number of warp strings. As you can see here, I'm gathering about 4 to 6 different warp strings at a time. The warp plays a really important role with the spacing and how much space the weft yarns have to play within the design. And in this case, we're using roving. It's very thick, it's fluffy, and you really want to show that off in the design while you're creating it. The other great thing about roving, it's really dense, and so it can hold its own. So when you're designing, don't be afraid to kind of go a little bit more bulky with it. You can also go less with it as well, but manipulating or using various numbers of warp strings when you're gathering them to create the design will play a really significant role in your design and how the roving appears in each row or section. If you want to learn more about warp spacing and practice projects that explore various warp spacings, then check out my ebook Side-by-Side Weaving Lines and Density. My next tip is add the roving to different parts of the warp. You can stack roving to the bottom, to the center of the design to create these small bumps or hills. As I mentioned before in tip 1, that roving is dense and it can stay in place. So use that to your advantage when you're developing the design. And if you're not sure exactly where it's going to fit, that's okay. You can always move it around, slide it around, and reweave it into place. So it's important that you just play, have fun with the placement. Here I've used roving that I've mixed, so the colors can also help add this depth or movement to the design. As in the previous sample that we did with the ombre effect, this helps create motion or direction in the design. So you can also use that when you're considering the design that you're creating, adding color or adding this motion to it. Roving doesn't have to only add texture to your piece, but it can also add these other design aspects to it. And my final tip for weaving with roving is don't forget to give definition to your design. As I mentioned before, roving is very textured and thick, and it can easily appear as a blob if you don't work on the sections that you add. So as you can see, I'm really taking the time to fix and develop the texture of the roving. In some parts I'm making it really fluffy. I'm trying not to pull it too tight. In other sections, maybe I am pulling it tighter. Roving can be manipulated in different ways, so just have fun with it, but also go back and fix it up, make it look the way you want it to look. So as a wrap up or conclusion to this video, we talked about roving and how it can add texture, movement, and color to your weaving. And as shown in this video, there are several ways that you can use roving in your weaving, such as adding a few strips between rows for color, or creating large puffs of texture, or even combining both color and texture within your design. I hope that this video has given you a few creative ideas and inspirations for your next project with roving. I would love to know which of these was your favorite, so please let me know in the comments down below. Also be sure to check out the Side-by-Side Weaving ebook. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time. Bye!